All right, here we go. 16.4 and 7.1. Both of them are going to be pretty short, so I'm going to combine them together. So we're starting down here at the bottom of page 438, talking about marine conservation. So the sticky note I put up was on here at page 439. Zoom in a little bit so we can see it better. So allowable harvests. That's basically the terminology of basically like what they kind of regulate is how much fish you can fish, like how many crab you can take, how many pounds of salmon you can take, how many pounds of tuna, and so on, so on, so on. That's what allowable harvest means. So allowable harvests are based on surveys that can be incorrect, since surveying fish populations is very difficult, which makes sense. Obviously, we can't just like stick some binoculars underwater and start counting. So one of the kind of the classic example of this they talk about right underneath it here is talking about the science of estimating population size and species is imprecise and can lead to significant changes in maximum sustained yield. For example, the cod population in the Gulf of Maine was sampled in 2008 and its biomass estimated at 34 million kilograms, or 74.9 million pounds. Allowable harvests by fishermen were set up based on this survey. A subsequent survey 3 years later, however, concluded that the cod biomass in the Gulf was only 12 million kilograms. This nearly one-third reduction in cod biomass was not explainable by fish harvest between 2008 and 2011. So resource managers concluded that the 2008 survey overestimated the cod population by putting too much weight on a few large trawls, which were not indicative of true cod numbers. Basically, it wasn't precise, so the allowable harvest, they allowed more cod to be caught than they should have, is basically kind of the gist of this thing. So surveys of fish, kind of like the observation portion of science, is incredibly, incredibly, incredibly important with this stuff. Now, scientists, they're now starting to move towards an ecosystem approach rather than an individual species approach. So we were just talking about the cod populations, and there was a cod moratorium that happened in the Grand Banks in Canada, and that really made some people mad. So they start talking about more of like an ecosystem approach, because if you take care of the ecosystem, the animals that live in that ecosystem will naturally increase in population. So that's what they're kind of leaning towards now. So basically take care of the entire ecosystem, and the few species that are there hopefully become more species, and then the whole ecosystem and the numbers of everything start increasing. That's what basically they're kind of shifting towards. Now, one of the things they use is a thing called the MPA, or the Marine Protected Areas. And I talk about this on the next page where my sticky note is. So the diagram down here on the bottom, I'll zoom out a little bit so we can see it. All the areas in purple are these marine protected areas, but a little bit less than 3% of the world's oceans are designated as those. And then on the next page, I'll talk about this a little bit more, but each of these little areas are protected from certain human activities, such as oil drilling, but you can still fish in those marine protected areas. So in theory, they sound great. And that's even what I wrote here. All right, so zoom in so you can see it a little bit better. So the marine protected areas seem like a great idea since they limit some human activities, i.e. oil drilling, but not as good in reality, because like I said, you can still fish there. Marine reserves are different. They have multiple benefits, because then basically if it's a marine reserve, you cannot fish. So the multiple benefits, if you have a marine reserve, inside that reserve, the biodiversity is increasing. The density of species increases, not only within a population, but other populations as well. Kind of everybody starts to pack in. The total biomass inside that marine reserve increases. The average size of the animals increases as well. Now, that seems all great, but obviously some people are going to push back, because basically you're telling them, hey, you can't fish here anymore. Every time you've tried to make a marine reserve, or countries have tried to make marine reserves, there's huge pushback from it. So right underneath the sticky note here, talk about George W. Bush, President George W. Bush established, and I'm not even going to try and say that, even though I lived in Hawaii, around the northwestern Hawaiian Islands. So 140,000 square miles, an area larger than all the U.S. national parks combined. Fishing was made off limits here except for native Hawaiians. That's kind of a big kick to all of this. Is basically, if you make a marine reserve, you're kind of more gearing yourself towards, or trying to gear like the big industrial commercial fishery vessels from them fishing. Because the native Hawaiians, they're not fishing to make millions of dollars. They're fishing to make a little bit of money and to feed their families, is basically what they're doing. So underneath it, a different example talks about basically an island that the United Kingdom controlled. They basically forced off some people so that the United States could build a military base there. Then they were fighting about like, hey, give us our land back. And then they made a marine reserve around it. So it's kind of one of those things that if you get your land back, then you can start fishing, but it's not too specific, unfortunately, for them. The picture over here that I want to talk about, they basically talk about on the previous page, kind of like the design of a marine reserve. So if you have a reserve, organisms are basically going to live there, then their larvae, and when they grow up, they're going to start, like they call it here, they're calling it spilling over. The book also talks about how the larvae of the species will, within the protected reserve, will quote unquote seed the seeds. Or seed the seas. Excuse me, I said that wrong. So if you have a small reserve, the fish and other organisms are going to migrate out, which is a good thing, but you need it to be a little bit bigger so kind of it can sustain itself. But if you go too big, this whole like they're moving and migrating out, they're not going to migrate out to the point where fishermen can make a living off of fishing them. So you got to find whatever that quote unquote medium reserve size is. So they'll migrate a little bit, and some organisms will stay in, which will kind of keep this ecosystem and this reserve functioning properly. But also some of them will leave a little bit more, some of them will leave just a little bit, some of them will leave more, some of them will leave a lot. So you basically need to make it so this kind of like, basically think of it like almost a production factory of fish and marine organisms stays the right size. All right, so now we're flipping all the way back to 7-1. So, yes, that's the Hulk. Okay, Mark Ruffalo. So he was a dude that was actually, basically, he was protesting about basically fracking, and what he's holding there is basically contaminated water that happened because of the fracking. So this kind of the science behind the story or the central case study here is kind of an interesting talk about what's going on with basically Pennsylvania and fracking and stuff like that, which leads us into policies. All right, and we've talked a little bit about this. We talked about this early on in the beginning of the year, a bunch of different policies. So kind of to go through some basics real fast, policy in and of itself is just simply the plans and the principles of kind of like a big idea is more of what the policy is. Now the public policy, those are the laws based on those plans and principles. So first off, you got to come up with the policy, kind of the overarching plan and principle for what's going on, and kind of the principles, you know, like the ethics and morals behind it. Public policy, you make the laws, and federal, state, local, municipality, stuff like that. They all make laws based on those policies. Then environmental policy, this governs how we interact with our environment. All right, so there's kind of like the three kind of like levels that we're dealing with. Policy, again, it's not the laws, not the regulations, just simply like the plans and the principles behind it. Then we got the laws and then so on. Now, hydraulic fracturing, or basically fracking, this is kind of an interesting thing because it puts science, economics, and ethics, unfortunately, all against each other as motivations for making policy. They should all go hand in hand, but politics is what politics is. So some people will grab onto this part, some people grab onto that part, some people grab onto that part. So science has made it so fracking is even possible, as well as basically you can make it so you can make money from it. So science not only made this technology possible, but science is also demonstrating the environmental impacts of fracking. The economics was also made by science, because again, they made this whole thing work. But economics also drives employment. So if the science is saying that fracking is bad, now the science is saying that the economics and the employment of people can be bad, or at least that's how people interpret it. then the ethics of it come into effect as well. Because if the ethics of fracking is making it so the water is not clean drinking water, from an ethics standpoint, that's not okay. And so when you're making policy, you kind of have these things kind of pitted against each other, unfortunately. Now, I wrote down here on page 162, basically capitalism, at least the capitalism here in the United States that's less regulated, capitalism demonstrates the need for government involvement. And there's three kind of things they talk about here that I'm going to kind of briefly summarize. So tragedy of the commons, we've talked about this a couple times. If basically there's a common resource and nobody's regulated by using it, it's just going to become overused, period. Because capitalism, and capitalism here in the United States, is all about the short-term gain. It's not kind of looking forward to the future and how it's going to impact not only that ecosystem, but the people around it and the employment around it, and so on, so on, so on. It's much more of like a short-term sighted thing. So if you have a common resource, it's going to be used very quickly. Free riders is another example. I'll kind of move over to where it talks about the free riders. It's real short and sweet. So let's say a community on a river suffers from water pollution that emanates from 10 different factories. The problem could, in theory, be solved if every factory voluntarily agreed to reduce its own pollution. However, once they all begin reducing their pollution, it becomes tempting for any one of them to stop doing so. A factory that avoids the efforts others are making would, in essence, get a free ride. Enough factories take a free ride, the whole collective endeavor will collapse. So that's where, again, government involvement needs to take place, because somebody basically needs to have oversight that every single one of those 10 factories is in fact doing what they said they were going to be doing. Now, external costs are also a big one as well. So let's say that a factory discharges a whole bunch of pollution into a river, and it just wipes out like the agriculture that's downstream that was using that water to water their crops. That's an external cost. That's one kind of good example. Or, like I just showed, and there's another picture on the top of 163 here. See, look how nasty that water looks. That water is because of the fracking. So that's the external costs. That's what we're talking about here. Now, the big question, and you guys have brought this up a whole bunch of different times, why doesn't common sense, beneficial, and publicly supported environmental ideas become policy? Politics. Like, I could rant for an hour about politics, but basically you can talk about, like, I don't even know how to really begin there. Basically, like, big money in politics. Like the big corporations want deregulation, so they support the campaigns of somebody who will do the deregulation. They also talk about a thing called a revolving door. So people from the industry will move into the government and move into government positions that regulate the industry they came from. Or they will move from the government into the industry, and back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. It's basically kind of just a whole bunch of unfortunate things that makes it so nothing really common sense occurs. And I don't really think I need to go into much more detail because you guys already know that. So last thing I write here is basically science is important, but is often disregarded. And this, again, goes into politics, because science is important, but if the science says something that goes against or kind of like hurts, quote unquote, a lawmaker's chances of getting reelected, they're going to ignore that policy. They're going to ignore that science. And that's what we've seen, unfortunately, this year, especially with COVID, is people are just kind of ignoring the science in order to make sure that like their law or their political career is extended. And then basically all it talks about, kind of like the fracking we were just talking about, this science behind the story is exactly what we're talking about here. And this here, 165, that's the end of 7.1, because that's at the beginning of 7.2. Let me know if you have questions.